Hi, everyone. Welcome to the February 4th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's stakes racing, which was headed by a trio of Kentucky Derby prep races, all of which were offering 10 qualifying points towards the winners of those races. They were the Holy Bull, the Withers, and the Robert B. Lewis out in California. We'll get to all of those as we discuss the races from each of those tracks, but we'll also mention the other stakes racing that took place last weekend, the return of last year's Belmont Stakes winner, Sir Winston, and a breakout performance by a filly that's created a lot of hype down at Oaklawn Park, that being Taraz, who's maybe going to enter the Kentucky Derby picture at some point. We'll see, but we'll talk about our respective opinions about her a little bit later in the podcast. Craig, we're going to begin at Gulfstream Park, and I don't know about you, but I thought that Tiz the Law was the most impressive of these Derby prep winners that we saw.
I did as well. I think he thrust himself right to the top of the three-year-old crop if he wasn't already there. He got a nice 117 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort. I think he probably learned some things. It wasn't the cleanest trip that you could hope for in there. Apparently, he was riding to instructions, but he broke like a shot and looked like he could have took the lead, took back, kind of got stuck in the pocket for a little bit. But once he got clear, he's just a fast horse. There's no doubt about it. He proved he can get the mile in the 16th. I doubt further distances are going to be outside his scope, and I just thought it was a really good effort. I thought the runner-up, Ete Indian, ran very well. He got a 113 in second, but he was just beaten by a better horse on this day.
Yeah, the most interesting part to me was that Tiz the Law was 6-5 in this race. I mean, personally, I know he was 3-5 on the morning line. I kind of assumed we'd see a lower price than that. I also think you probably assumed you'd get about twice the price that you got on Ete Indian, who was a good opinion by you. He ran well to be second in this race. He was bet down to 4-1, and Toledo went off at 9-5, which just totally baffles me. I didn't see him being that short of a price in this race. But the wagering aside, I agree with everything you said about Tiz the Law. Just a really solid effort. I saw a little bit of criticism of Manny Franco's ride because there was a little bit of jostling heading into the first turn as he was trying to get the horse to the outside as they headed onto the backstretch. He was just riding to instructions, though. You could see after the race that Barclay Tagg had said he didn't want this horse to get jammed up inside like it happened in his prior race, the Kentucky Jockey Club. So the instructions were to get him into that clear on the outside, and Manny Franco did the job, even if it looked maybe a little bit awkward. But from about the 5/8 pole home, Tiz the Law got a perfect trip and just basically took over the race and proved to be best. Ete Indian validated his performance last time out. I thought he ran well, and Toledo just basically ran back to his last race. He did not take a step forward, and I imagine we won't see much more of him on the Derby trail.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. Ete Indian, even him, I'm not sure he wants to go any farther than we saw on Saturday. So probably Tiz the Law is really the only Derby contender we're going to see out of this race. But again, it was a very good performance. It's as good as we've seen.
Yeah, the only thing that I don't like to see with Tiz the Law, and it's going to be a theme as we talk about all of these Derby prep races, is that they're talking about having just one more prep race for him, whether it be the Louisiana Derby or the Florida Derby. I just hate these horses taking big layoffs during the springtime because I guess the connections are trying to keep these horses sound and not take too many chances running them before the Derby, because it seems like the goal these days is to get to the Kentucky Derby starting gate, not necessarily to have the best prepared horse to win the race. But we can talk about that a little bit more with some of the other horses. Just a pet peeve of mine. We saw a similarly exciting performance 2 races earlier on Saturday at Gulfstream in that Grade 3 Swale. Good pick by you, Craig, on the winner, Mischievous Alex, who broke from the inside. Irad Ortiz maintained that rail position down the backstretch despite some other horses being sent towards the front end. And by the time they got to the far turn, you could tell this horse was just going easier than the others.
Yeah, he was really impressive. He got almost the same speed figure as Tiz the Law with a 116, which matched his last race, and it matched the same figure he got in his last race. I thought this was a strong race. Chivalry ran well. I think he got a career top with a 109. And Greenlight Go, he's the one I'm not sure what to make of. He got a 105, which is basically what he was running as a 2-year-old. And I know you had caution that maybe he was just a big, strong 2-year-old that developed a little before the others. And unless you can find some trouble with this trip that I didn't see, I wasn't very impressed with him. The one you do have to watch is Untitled, who also came in with a big figure off his maiden win. He definitely had a little more trouble than some others, I think, in here, particularly at the break, which caused him some issues. And I thought he ran okay to be a distant fourth. I mean, he was only a quarter length out of second, I believe. Not sure he could have beat Mischievous Alex in this one, but maybe he could have gotten second with a better start.
Yeah, Untitled was the one that you really want to watch for out of this race because it was just a second career start. He hadn't broken badly in his debut, but he wasn't off that sharply in his debut either. He rushed up from the inside. This day, he broke maybe about a half step slowly. And the comment that I see in the chart, ping pong start, that's pretty apt because that's what happened to him. He just got bounced around between the two horses inside and outside of him, one of them being Mischievous Alex. And he was out of position for basically the entire race. I thought he ran pretty well to almost get up for second here. He never quit running. You like to see that with a lightly raced horse who has never run that way before. So he's one that I assume will do better next time out. I'm honestly not sure how far any of these horses want to go. I saw that John Service, the trainer of Mischievous Alex, was saying they might try the Gotham next, but he did caution that they're not necessarily using that race as a Derby prep because he's not sure this horse is really a two-turn type. He just thinks the one-turn mile might suit him well enough.
Yeah, it's a little interesting to me because the way he ran, the pace figures were even throughout the race. That often bodes to horses who can go a little bit further. I'm certainly not saying he's a 1.25 mile horse for the Derby, but it wouldn't surprise me if this one could handle two turns. The rest, I tend to agree they're probably sprinters with the exception of Untitled. I'm just not sure what we have with him based on that effort.
Wrapping up the graded stakes action that we saw on Saturday at Gulfstream Park was the Grade 3 Forward Gal. This one also at 7 furlongs for the 3-year-old fillies. Not quite the quality that we saw in the Swale, though, as tonalist shape. She stayed undefeated here. She's now won all 4 of her starts, but she wasn't facing much competition. She was bet down to 1-5 for a reason. She's not a horse that I'm personally that excited about, and I wasn't thrilled with her performance here either. I think there'll be a time in the future I'll got to bet against this horse, but this was not the day.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing. She ran slow compared to the Mischievous Alex. She only got a 95 TimeformUS speed figure. The pace was pretty quick in here, so you can't fault it, that she didn't have anything to run into. And she basically just beat overmatched horses. She did what she had to do. The third place finisher was a first-time starter who went off at huge odds to kind of tell you what she was facing in here. Good run from that horse, but it's just not a very strong field, and I wouldn't put this one anywhere on my top 10 of 3-year-old fillies in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, I saw some chatter on social media about Nikki and Papa being a Kentucky Oaks contender off this performance, and I would say hold your horses a little bit because, she got an 83 TimeformUS speed figure, which wouldn't be good enough to hit the board in a lot of maiden races at Gulfstream. This was just not a strong Grade 3 event. It was really a Grade 3 in name only, and Nikki and Papa did have significant trouble at the start, and she might be a promising type of runner, but you have to run a lot faster than that to put yourself in the conversation for a Kentucky Oaks contender. Let's move over to the turf to discuss another stakes race from Saturday at Gulfstream. That was the ungraded Dania Beach for the 3-year-olds going a mile. And this race to me was all about the trips because it's hard to know how the pace shook out. I'll let you talk about that a little bit. But Field Pass, the winner, just thought everything pretty much went right for him. He saved ground around the turns. Paco Lopez was able to find that split for him in the stretch, whereas some others didn't have that same clear run in the stretch, and he was able to just get up.
He was. This was a race we talked about on the forecast, how evenly matched it was. And that's basically how it turned out on the track. At least the top 4 that I'm looking at right now all ran 103 or 102 TimeformUS speed figures. And those are exactly the kind of races that come down the trips, which I agree with you. I think this one did. Get Smokin' opened up a lead. We don't know how fast the pace was, and frankly, it's probably going to be impossible to tell. The race was mistimed for whatever reason, as were both of the stakes races on Saturday. There was one for fillies that came back quite a bit slower than this one even, but with the rails out as far as they are, the crazy run-ups they have at Gulfstream, there's just no real way to time these races from video and get a good read. So this is a case where if I had to guess, I would think the pace was pretty even because we had horses up near the front that ran well. We had horses come from off the pace to run pretty well. So I'm not sure what to make of it other than to say it was just, a solid 3-year-old race. It wasn't graded, and that's probably, I don't know that any of these are really graded stakes type horses.
Yeah, I think that's pretty unclear. I mean, it's a decent enough speed figure for this early in the year with the 3-year-olds on the turf, but we're going to see some much faster runners as the months progress, I would hope pretty soon. I mean, the 2 horses that I would say maybe were most compromised by trips in this race were the 4th place finisher Miami, who broke a little bit slowly, was just towards the back of the pack in a race that wasn't really conducive to making those big late runs. So he ran well to get within about 3/4 of a length of the winner. And the other horse, as I mentioned, Homeland, had real trouble at the top of the stretch, was blocked at about the 3/16 pole. It's unclear how much run he really had because once he did get more of a clear path late, he didn't really pick up the pace at all, but just not an ideal trip for a horse trying to come from the back of the pack. Early in the day at Gulfstream, we saw an allowance race that was going the same distance as the Holy Bull, 1.16 with that short stretch run. And the winner of this race, Fearless, who is a 4-year-old for Todd Pletcher, ran almost the exact same time as the Holy Bull winner, Tiz the Law. He just happened to win this race by a much larger margin. Fearless seems like an interesting horse for Pletcher because he was bet down to 1-5 in his debut, going 6 furlongs. Was not that impressive winning that day, but apparently he's just a horse that really wanted to go the 2 turns.
Yeah, this was impressive. He got a 1:18 Timeform US speed figure. It was actually a little slower than the Holy Bull, but the pace was a little quicker. So they actually final times flip-flopped with our overall rating. But yeah, I don't know what to make of this horse. Second time out, 4-year-old. I assume he's had some issues, but there certainly wasn't anything to not be impressed with here. He sat. It's not like he had an easy lead. He was right there battling with another long shot on the lead through a decent pace. It wasn't anything coded in red or anything, but it was all right. And he just drew away. There's not a whole lot of competition in this race. I guess Kid Bourbon was the even money favorite coming in off a 110 Timeform US speed figure, but he didn't really run his race. He just kind of dropped back and didn't do any running at all, clunked up for 4th. So solid effort for second time. I have to obviously improve a bit to be able to advance in the stakes company, but that 118 isn't too far away. And with the older division we're seeing this year, he could certainly make the jump with any further improvement.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest this is not a legitimate performance. Kid Bourbon, as you mentioned, didn't have, I think, the trip they had outlined because he got squeezed back going into the first turn and ended up, I think, much farther back than they would have envisioned. And these races going 1.16 at Gulfstream are so often decided just a few jumps out of the gate because they break right into that turn. And Fearless broke really well, and Irad Ortiz hustled him to the lead and made sure he got over from that number 8 post position to get into the 2 path by the time they were entering the turn, which is pretty remarkable. And I think that just decided the race. Fearless was best. I mean, there's no question about it. But some others in behind might not have had the best trips. Interested to see where Fearless goes from here. He's got a really nice pedigree. The Dam is a half to Far From Over, who was an impressive winner of the Withers a number of years ago. We'll get to a discussion of the Withers pretty shortly. But this horse is definitely bred to go longer, so we'll see where Pletcher takes him from here. Speaking of fast allowance victories, we saw another one on Sunday at Gulfstream Park. Almost an oddly fast race as Trophy Chaser, who is a horse that had had most of his success around 1 turn prior to this, stretched out to the 1.125 distance and just blew the doors off this field and ran the kind of speed figure that I didn't know he was capable of.
Yeah, I certainly didn't either. I actually have, when I make these figures, I don't have names or anything in front of me. Of course, I know the stakes horses, who everybody is 9 times out of 10, but this one I didn't. I kind of did a double take and had to go back and look and make sure I wasn't just doing something silly or there wasn't a timing error. But it certainly looked like a legit performance. He wound up with a 124, which I think is the fastest speed figure of the week, if memory serves. I think it was even a little quicker than the older horses at Santa Anita we'll talk about later, but just a really big effort from him. I'm not sure where it came from, but I didn't see anything that would say it wasn't a legitimately fast race.
Yeah, I mean, watching it, it seems legitimate. The only weird part are the horses involved. I mean, the only horse that you would have expected to run this kind of speed figure in the top three was the second place finisher, Scars Are Cool, who has shown an affinity for a mile and an eighth in the past and has run these kind of speed figures in the past. But the winner, Trophy Chaser, he had run some numbers in the high one teens back in early in his 3-year-old season, going a one-turn mile. But the third place finisher, McCarron, had been a confirmed turf sprinter, and Todd Pletcher stretched him out to a mile and an eighth on the dirt here, and he ran one of the highest speed figures of his career. That was bizarre. And some of the other horses who you would have thought would relish this distance just finished far back and lost by double digits, like Weather Whiz and Harvey Wallbanger. Now, Weather Whiz was compromised at the start because Trophy Chaser and Paco Lopez came out about 2 paths at the start and took out a couple of horses. So that certainly helped Trophy Chaser get that perfect trip that he ended up working out. But that said, he still ran the race that he ran. And if he can continue putting forth these kinds of speed figures, he's going to be a competitor in graded stakes races pretty soon.
Yeah, what I found interesting, I wanted to point out about McCarron is, though he's been on turf for a while, and certainly the distance is surprising. He was a horse who actually debuted on dirt and won really easily at Keeneland, and then ran a very close third in the whatever they call that race on Derby week for 2-year-olds at Churchill. Now I think it's the Kentucky Juvenile or something like that, and did so with pretty nice speed figures for 2-year-olds. So maybe it's a case that he's just been on the wrong surface, or maybe he just handles both equally well, but the distance is certainly surprising. And he's a horse as the speed figure guy that I'll be tracking going forward to kind of make sure this is a legitimate speed figure.
Yeah, I had forgotten. He was one of those Wesley Ward bullets back in the day, I believe, and just gone through a couple of barn changes, and apparently he's a completely different horse now. So yeah, it'll be interesting to monitor how he does in the future, because I would imagine, based on this performance, they'll keep him in dirt routes from here on out. One more race to discuss from Gulfstream Park on Sunday. That was a maiden event early in the day, and Todd Pletcher, it seems like he's been firing a lot of bullets among these first-time starters at the Gulfstream meet, and he had another one here as Eve of War, a 3-year-old filly, just totally dominated this 6-furlong race. She didn't break that well, but she rushed up and took a clear lead on the backstretch and just never looked back after that.
No, and she did everything you could ask, I guess, after the break. She got a 105 TimeformUS speed figure, which is certainly very good for a debuting 3-year-old in early January. She wasn't really pressured at any point, so I'm not sure what to make of that. There wasn't a whole lot of competition in here. It was mostly first-time starters, and she appears to be the only one to have done any real running. So I'm not sure what to make of her. Curious what you think of her breeding and what it portends for her future.
Her breeding says that she could be any kind of horse. She's by declaration of war, who appears to be as versatile of a sire as there is out there. And her dam wasn't much, but her second dam was a horse called Bedenkin, who was 11 for 19 lifetimes. She was a multiple stakes winner on dirt and turf, going sprints and routes. So it seems like this filly could do it all. I think they have a lot of options with where they send her next. And this was a fast debut win, so I would imagine that it won't be long before we see her in stakes. Let's go up north to Aqueduct to discuss the races from this past weekend. And we'll begin with that Derby prep that we were mentioning a little bit before, that being the Grade 3 Withers, which they ran on Saturday. This one was over a mile and an eighth over a demanding, slow Aqueduct main track. I know there was a lot of discussion about some of the fractions of these races at Aqueduct this week being very slow. If you haven't been watching a lot this winter, the track is just dead there. Max Player for Linda Rice stepped up off a maiden victory. We had talked about this horse in depth on the forecast last week, why he was likely to move forward. And I think he probably moved forward more than either of us even expected, as this race earned a respectable TimeformUS speed figure. An interesting player, a new entrant onto the Derby trail.
Yeah, I was impressed with this horse. I really liked the ride that Dylan Davis gave this horse. He kept him right up close where he probably needed to be. I think you had mentioned he was a horse you kind of have to urge early on to get into the race. But he wound up with a 114 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which isn't too far off the other 3-year-old races we're talking about today. Shotsky also got a 114 in second, kind of backing up his Remsen win. And Portos ran a 109. about what we expected. He was further back, as you had predicted on that forecast. The horse with the obvious interesting trip was Monday Morning Quarterback. I don't know what to make of this horse. I think you have to give him some credit for that tough trip. And if you believe it hurt him at all, that was a very impressive race by him to get a 110, even back and forth. He looked like he was going to be second and maybe even challenge for the win very deep in the stretch.
Yeah, they just had to change the game plan with him because he didn't break well. He was towards the back of the pack. It looked like he was going to be the fastest of the speed horses just based on pace figures and given his post position. But Jorge Vargas had to totally adjust the plan coming out of the gate. And he did make that backstretch move into contention. And he was even fighting for the victory at the 8th hole before Max Player just kicked it into another gear. And off this performance, I'd like to see him in another Derby prep. I think he earned his right to continue down this trail. Cutting back to a race like the Gotham seems like it might be ideal for him because you know that he likes one turn. And now you also know that he can rate behind horses and pass them. So there's a lot to like about Monday Morning Quarterback. I think if they move on to the Gotham, it sounds like Max Player would skip the Gotham. Linda Rice does not want to turn this horse back to a one-turn mile, which I think is understandable based on the way he ran here. I'd like to see this horse get a bit more experience because he's obviously still very green. They're talking about just moving straight to the Wood Memorial from here, that being one more race before the Kentucky Derby. I'm not sure that would be enough for this horse, but I do think he has more improvement in him because once he figures things out and learns how to run for an entire race, he obviously has no problem with the distance, and I would imagine there might be another forward move in him. Let's head on to a race from Sunday at Aqueduct over the same distance for the 3-year-old fillies, that being the ungraded Busanda, though it still does offer qualifying points towards the Kentucky Oaks. And I'm imagining that we're going to see the winner of this race in the Kentucky Oaks based on this performance, that being Harvey's Little Goyle, who had shown real promise when she made her second start at Aqueduct, winning a one-turn mile maiden race impressively, but she took another step forward here, and I just loved everything about this performance, aside from the fact that she didn't break well. After that, Junior Alvarado rode her like he had the winner the entire way, and she just dominated this field.
She did. She got a 108 TimeformUS speed figure for the victory. Visually, it was very impressive. She was wide most of the way, wide around the first turn, wide down the back stretch, made a not quite as wide a move, did move in a little bit, but still kind of wide on the second turn. And what really stuck out for me was that move between the half and 3/4. I actually had to go check the timing on this one as the pace figures for the race moved from like a 106 for the leader to where Harvey's Little Goyle took the lead and the pace figure was a 117. That's just a giant move that you don't often see at that point in the race, particularly from lately raced 3-year-old fillies. When you consider that part of that comes on that second turn and she was wide, it was just really eye-catching, and I think she's a super promising 3-year-old filly. My one concern is with that track at Aqueduct that you mentioned, in that it's just been so slow lately. Not that it makes the speed figures wrong. I mean, you have to adjust for the speed of the track. But when these horses move on to bigger and better races, I am concerned the surface is just going to be so much different than what they're running on right now that you might not be getting a true picture of how they'll handle a faster track.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I personally don't consider that kind of stuff too much unless it's a really quirky surface. And I don't feel that Aqueduct is. It seems like horses generally handle this track. They just run slower times. What you said about that mid-race move by Harvey's Little Goyle, I mean, you could see it even on the replay because moving down the backstretch, she was 3 or 4 wide, but she was running right alongside Water White, who was riding the rail. And in the blink of an eye, once Junior Alvarado pressed the button, Water White came off the bridle and dropped 3 lengths behind her, and the entire field strung out in the span of about 1/8 of a mile. And they all had to play catch up by that point. Or Harvey's Little Goyle had just taken over the race and opened up an insurmountable advantage. She seems like the kind of horse that's going to relish this 9-furlong distance moving forward and might even want to go farther in the future once they get to a race like the Alabama, if she makes it that far, because she's bred to run all day, being that daughter of American Pharaoh. As I've mentioned multiple times, her dam's family is stellar. Her dam's a half to Kentucky Derby and Preakness winner. I'll have another. So just a really exciting prospect. And obviously, you'd like to see her do it again on another kind of surface, and she probably won't get the opportunity to do that until Kentucky Oaks weekend, because I imagine they'll move on to a race like the Gazelle, which is also at Aqueduct. But she's earned her ticket in my book so far, because this is among the fastest speed figures that we've seen from a 3-year-old filly in a route race so far.
Yeah, no doubt. I have her at the top of my list. I know we're going to talk about a filly from Oaklawn soon that others seem to like a little bit more, but I was more impressed by her race here.
Now, two more performances that we'll discuss from Aqueduct took place on Friday. There was no stakes race this day, but two fast speed figures were earned. One of them, not so surprisingly, by last year's Belmont Stakes winner, Sir Winston, who returned in a 1 mile optional claiming race on Friday. I think the only surprising thing about this race was, well, two things: his price, since they didn't bet him at all, and the way that he won it, because Sir Winston showed this explosive turn of foot at the top of the stretch that I hadn't seen out of him since last year's Peter Pan. And to me, it's really encouraging that he got back to that kind of performance and makes me a lot more excited about his prospects as a 4-year-old.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He only got a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure, but I think a lot of that had to do with the pace. We have the early fractions coded in blue. Laytone, who seems like we talk about every other week on the Pacecast because he runs so often, was off on a clear lead, setting his own pace, and it just didn't matter. Sir Winston did kind of have to bull his way through at the top of the stretch, but once he did, the result was never in doubt. I thought it was a really strong run through the stretch and at a distance which probably isn't going to be his best. That can only be an encouraging sign that he ran so well.
Yeah, and I think that's the real point here is that the 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure, it's not going to make him a top handicap horse, but the potential is there for him to move forward because we've already seen that he's a horse that is going to relish every bit of distance that he can get. And we've also seen, if you look at the Belmont Stakes, that he's able to race a little closer to the pace when they go slower up front. Obviously, this being a one-turn mile race, they're going to go naturally a little faster, even though the pace was slow relative to the final time. I really was encouraged. I had a lot of doubts, and I'm a big fan of Sir Winston. I didn't bet this race. I probably should have bet him at 4-1 in retrospect, but I was a little concerned after that turf race that we might not see him step forward this year. And I don't know if they're actually going to go to the Dubai World Cup. I know that's what they're talking about, but he's as exciting, I think, now as any newly turned 4-year-old out there. So I'm excited to see where they do end up going with him.
Yeah, me too, because, depending where he showed up, I would certainly bet him against some horses that would come in with some better figures, assuming there was some pace in the field. You never know about that. But again, I thought it was just a really good effort and bodes well for a very good 4-year-old season.
Yeah. And something that was a little interesting on Friday was that there was another horse on that card that earned the exact same speed figure as Sir Winston, going the same distance, earning basically the same, achieving basically the same final time on the clock. And that was Where's Rudy, who won an $8,000 claiming race 2 races earlier on the card. Just discussing this because it's an interesting to make the comparison between these 2 races at the same distance. Where's Rudy is a horse who had run one fast speed figure in the past, but he had really plummeted down the claiming ranks to now hit this bottom level. But Rudy Rodriguez, who had him for that prior good effort, got him back to his best performance here.
He did. Who knows where that race came from? But when you look at the speed figures, it was really a pretty easy one to make. It was a fairly easy Aqueduct day, and he just ran a fast race. I can't remember the horse's name. We had a claimer do something similar at Saratoga. For Danny Gargan, I believe it was, ran like a 120-something speed figure, and that horse has never come back to match it again. If I were a betting man, I would guess that Where's Rudy probably wouldn't do this again anytime soon, but you never know. I would definitely pay attention to where Rudy Rodriguez, who trains him, places him next time out, and that would probably tell you a lot about what to expect with a horse like this.
Yeah, I imagine he won't be at another $8,000 claiming race next time. And if he is, that's probably not a good sign. So we'll see where he does turn up next time out. Let's move on to Santa Anita, and we'll talk about the last of the 3 Derby preps that were run last Saturday. That was the Grade 3 Robert B. Lewis going 1 mile on the 16th out there. And for me, this was one of the more puzzling races because I was looking for a breakout performance from Thousand Words, the winner, who is still undefeated. I'm not sure that this was it, but I also don't feel like he ran poorly, so I don't want to knock him too much.
No, he ran fine. He got a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure. He beat Royal Act, who I thought ran surprisingly well, trying the dirt for the first time, who got a 1:15. And back in third, we had the other Bob Baffert trainee, High Velocity, who actually got a slightly higher speed figure, getting beat a length with a 1:17. Personally, I don't put a lot of stock in that one because I think High Velocity is a horse who doesn't want to go this far. I kind of mentioned that on the forecast. I saw no reason to think he could hang on against 1,000 Words this time when he couldn't do it last time. And I think he'd be better served by one turn, maybe one turn mile races. But, 1,000 Words did what he's supposed to do. He doesn't have that kind of brilliance you kind of look for and equate with Bob Baffert, exciting 3-year-olds. We haven't seen that for a few years since Justify. He had a whole string last year. And I kind of got the same feeling with them, with horses like Game Winner, that they were just decent. But off of this race, watching it, the figure's okay, but I was still more impressed with the Holy Bull winner, Tis the Law, than I was with this one, just from a visual and slightly numerical standpoint when you look at the trips.
Yeah, for me, there's this divergence between what the numbers say and what I actually see from this horse, because, just on the surface of things, looking at the data, he's raced 3 times, he's won all 3, and he's earned speed figures of 114, 115, and 116. This is a horse that we're supposed to be really excited about, even though he hasn't run the fastest number yet. He's run relatively fast in all 3 of his starts. It's just he's never won by a particularly large margin. I think there's still some question about the quality of the horses that he's beating. And watching these races, he got an absolutely perfect trip in this race. And once he swung out into the clear in the stretch, I know he had to take a slight bump, but you would have thought he would draw off and win by 2 lengths. And he just was sort of grinding it out, gradually got by these horses. Royal Act, who got that wide trip, still was in it at about the 16th pole. So I'm just not sure what to make of 1,000 Words. Yeah, sure, he can continue improving. Royal Act probably ran the best race because I was looking at the Trackers figures just to confirm what we saw visually, and he covered 40 more feet than the winner based on that data. So with a better trip, he arguably could have won this race. He has that dirt pedigree, even though he only run on turf so far. So there might be a higher ceiling with him. And those would be the only 2 that I'd want out of this race. And I would just be interested to see where they go next.
Yeah, same here. The one thing I do want to say for 1,000 Words is he's certainly shown he's competitive and seems to have that will to win, because he does win those close finishes. And yeah, I imagine he'll show up, and I haven't tracked which race. I'm sure he'll probably stay at Santa Anita they got a couple more options coming up. But yeah, it will be interesting to see who shows up for that and who will have to beat.
Now, a performance that I know surprised both you and I a little bit was the San Pasquale, which was won by Midcourt. This horse, I know we both had some doubts about after he had put forth that disappointing effort in, I believe it was the San Antonio in late December, when he didn't break that well and was just kind of sluggish for the entire race. He was anything but sluggish in this San Pasquale, as he broke maybe a little flat-footed, but Victor Espinosa really hustled him after that. He got to the front end and just never looked back.
Yeah, he didn't. The race looked over after a half mile. It looked like nobody was going to catch him. And in fact, nobody did. Nobody even made up any ground. He was pulling away a little bit at the end. I guess certainly possible I underestimated the trouble he had at the start last time, and maybe he's just a horse who really wants to be on front, or he doesn't do his best running. I do want to mention this is a race that we broke out from the others from a speed figure perspective. He got a 123. There were a couple other route races, including the 1,000 Words. There was one other one on the card. But if I use the same variant from those races for this one, not only would it have put Midcourt into the 130s, which I don't think he's capable of, it would have vaulted all the other horses behind them well above what they're capable of running. So I actually did check. I very rarely look at buyer speed figures, but I was just curious what he would do with this race. And he basically did the same thing. I think our figure and his figure line up pretty much the same way. So no real difference of opinion on that one. But in case people are wondering and they pull out the old time charts and wonder why there's only a 7-point difference between the Lewis and the San Pasquale, that's all. This was a race sandwich in between turf races, so it's certainly possible the track was worked on and conditions changed, and the numbers seem to point to that almost as a certainty.
And I'll just say the most impressive part about this race for me was the final eighth of a mile, where midcourt just rebroken the stretch and was actually widening on the field as they came to the finish. I mean, just looking at the raw times, which I think you can do because it's not like the track was really souped up on Saturday at Santa Anita. I mean, he came home his last eighth of a mile in 12.27 seconds. That's really impressive in a mile and an eighth race over a track like Santa Anita. So he just seems to me like a horse that if he can get towards the front end, as you were mentioning, he seems like a totally different racehorse and one that can compete in these higher level graded stakes races. So he's got the right trainer in his corner, John Sheriffs, who gets these horses to develop over time. If he can continue putting together performances like this, he'll be a force in the handicap division.
Yeah, I should mention the pace was just kind of moderate. It's kind of surprising to see in a grade 2 race for older males that a horse was able to just get a very easy lead. I think it was on top by more than 2 lengths with only low 120 pace figures on our pace figure scale. But that's just the way racing is in 2020. Riders don't seem to be as aggressive, even in California. Probably has something to do with the track being slower than it used to be 3 or 4 years ago. But you got a handicap for that. So just wanted to point it out. It's not as surprising as it would have been, but still a little, when you look at the charts, it's unexpected at times. Just looking back in the past, I almost always expected 140s, 130s, maybe some red, but that seems to be changing.
Yeah, that's just the way they ride the races these days. We did see some red in the race that took place right before the San Antonio, the San Pasquale rather, that being the San Marcos on the turf, going 1.25 miles. And we had talked about this race quite a bit on the forecast last week, sort of making the case that it was way more wide open and the field was way more evenly matched than the public was likely to bet it. And unfortunately, the 3 favorites finished 1, 2, 3 in order, but I think we were right about the race and we had some good ideas because they were all bunched together at the finish line. And I mean, with slightly different trips, the result could have been totally different.
Yeah, it could have been. They all got basically the same speed figure. I think the top 4 or 5 horses in here all got 119 or 118. Brown Storm went to the front. You had pointed him out on the forecast, and I actually thought he was going to hang on for a little while there at pretty big odds. But in the end, United just showed his class. He was a runner-up in the Breeders' Cup. I guess that has to count for something. And he wore down the field. He did it while up much closer than he usually is. So a good effort from him. Cleopatra Strike does what he usually does in finishing second. He's got to be a frustrating horse to train. It seems like everything just has to go perfect for that horse to get his nose up on the wire. But all in all, I'm not very impressed by this race. It was a grade 2. It got slightly subpar figures for a grade 2. And I imagine we'll just see these horses probably face each other several more times this year.
Yeah, I have nothing really to add to that. Brown Storm, who I liked in the race, gave me a thrill. Just ended up going a little bit too fast on the front end, and also it seemed like he didn't take the turns that well as he drifted about 3 wide coming off the far turn. That's not ideal when you're riding a front runner, but I don't think the jockey really had any control over that. United just has a slight edge on this group, I think. I mean, he was 3 wide for the entire way without cover, so I don't want to knock him for getting the victory in this race. He was best. It's just, how good is this group really? United hasn't run back to that big performance in the Breeders' Cup turf yet. And I know now they're talking about going out to Dubai to tackle the Dubai Shima Classic with him. I don't know. Good luck with that. I mean, I haven't seen him being the kind of dominant American horse that could handle that kind of challenge, but I guess anything's possible. One more race we'll discuss briefly from Saturday at Santa Anita was an allowance race early in the day. That was won by Auberge for Bob Baffert. This filly had run a really fast speed figure in her debut, and I know we were both a little bit skeptical of that number when she came back in the Santa Ynez next time out, but she validated it, and she did again on Saturday. She ran another pretty fast race to beat an overmatched field.
She did. What I thought it was a really odd spot for Bob Baffert to send this horse out, turning back in distance, way back in class. She totally had the field over a barrel. And that's how she ran. I mean, Speech is a decent horse. She ran second. She was a second choice in here. She had run a 105 compared to 111 for Auberge. And they basically ran the same exact races again. 109 for Auberge, 106 for Speech, and then well back to the rest, I think it was. And solid filly. I mean, she's running as fast as anybody. I'm just really puzzled by the placement and the turn back, because that doesn't seem like a horse that Bob Baffert has a lot of thoughts of going longer based on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he does have other horses for those big races going longer, like Bast, of course. And I know he has other 3-year-old fillies out there, even if their names are escaping me right now. So maybe he's got a different plan in mind for her. We'll see, but she's capable of running some fast speed figures. I think she's already proven that. Let's stick with the 3-year-old fillies and move on to the final venue that we're going to visit on this Pacecast. That's Oaklawn Park, where I think the race that generated the most excitement on their Saturday card was the Martha Washington for the 3-year-old fillies, going that 1 mile distance. And not the most competitive field, but there was a horse in the lineup, Taraz, who Bob Baffert and Judd Mondt have mentioned as a possible Kentucky Derby contender if she ends up racing in the preps. We'll see. They haven't decided that yet. But she just looked to dominate this field on paper. She was bet down to 1-9 for a reason, and she dominated them on the racetrack. But what did you make of this performance? Because I think people are going a little overboard with this filly.
I do too. I mean, I guess there's been some backtracking from the trainer. They were originally talking about moving into the try Colts right away. And personally, I don't see it. She really beat nothing in here. She ran fine. I mean, obviously there's no knocks on the race, but it wasn't particularly fast. She got a 105 Timeform US speed figure, which just doesn't even put her near the top of the pack for the fillies. I mean, it's there with some others we've talked about, and it's faster than some, slower than others. And I'm just not seeing it. Maybe people are equating that she's winning easy. She could have run faster, but usually you see that after 3 starts, and she hasn't done it yet. So she's a horse I will probably be looking to take on at the window pretty soon if she faces any competition. Probably the best horse she's faced so far was Ursula, who, she ran okay next time out in the Silver Bullet Day. She was second behind Finite, but that wasn't a particularly fast race either. So there's others I like better, including Harvey's Little Goyle, who we talked about earlier, if I had to make a pecking order for 3-year-old fillies.
Yeah, and I want to be clear about this. I mean, I was basically just trying to start some controversy in saying that Harvey's Little Goyle is a better horse than Taraz. I mean, obviously, we don't know a whole lot about either of these horses yet, and they have to prove it against top-level competition. But the point I'm making with Taraz is that people are talking about this horse like she's Rachel Alexandra. And let's remember, Rachel Alexandra, when she was sweeping these Oaklawn races for the fillies, was running speed figures that made her as fast, if not faster, than the Colts at the time. Taraz is nowhere close to that. She's earned speed figures, as you said, that don't even make her among the fastest 3-year-old fillies. And all of this hype is seemingly just coming from the fact that she's bigger than the Colts. I mean, she's a really big, imposing looking horse, but that doesn't make horses necessarily faster. I mean, Imperial Hint, who's one of the smallest horses in the country, is arguably one of the best sprinters out there. So size really doesn't have a whole lot to do with how fast horses can run. So I don't get why this horse's physical attributes are making people go crazy about her as, the horse that can take on the Colts.
Yeah, I agree. I'm hoping she'll face some more competition next time out. And again, I don't have any real knocks on the horse. My one comment I made on Twitter was I just didn't understand why they'd want to put her in against Colts, because personally, I think she'd get buried. I'm not trying to knock her at all. It's just a huge leap up to some of these Colts, both in terms of talent, and you can see it in the speed figures, and just the pace she's going to face. It would just be a completely different ball game. And maybe if her next start she runs a lot faster and wins easier, I'd be more impressed. But I just didn't see it on Saturday.
Yeah, and I think there's still a big question about how far she wants to go, because she's a daughter of Into Mischief, and Judd Mondt has a full sibling who's also by Into Mischief out of this dam, whose name is South Sea, who's just a confirmed dirt sprinter. So we'll see what she does moving forward. I'm skeptical of the just based on the goals that they're setting for this filly, but we'll see where she goes. It'll be exciting to watch at the very least. One more race to discuss on this podcast briefly, the American Beauty, which was also on Saturday at Oaklawn Park. This was supposed to be a matchup between Amy's Challenge and Irish Mischief. Amy's Challenge making her return from a long layoff here. Neither of these horses ran up to their best efforts. Maybe they just sort of dueled each other into defeat. Although Irish Mischief was a little bit off the pace, it did fall apart late, though, and it set up for Special Relativity, who, as we mentioned on the forecast last week, just relished this turn back in distance.
Yeah, she came back, I think it was in a week, and ran very well. The pace was pretty hot. Amy's Challenge didn't run as well as she has. Maybe that longer layoff than usual kind of told the tale here, where she maybe lost a little bit or wasn't quite ready like she usually is. She did face a lot of pressure from Mount Brave early, but that was fairly predictable. That's usually the kind of horse she's been able to handle in the past. And Special Relativity just sat back, wasn't too far off the pace, even though back in fifth. And turning for home, she always looked like a winner. She ran a 112 TimeformUS speed figure, which was a point better than her last time out. And everybody else didn't really run the races they're capable of. Speaking of Irish Mischief and Amy's Challenge, so she kind of almost inherited the win, but not taking anything away from her performance. She had that good tactical speed, took advantage of the situation, and just ran the race she usually does.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Special Relativity is just an honest horse. We saw her winning those listed stakes at Saratoga last year, running similar kinds of speed figures. So you know she's capable of it. She's just not one of the best filly sprinters in the country. Amy's Challenge has shown the ability to get there, but based on this performance, she's going to have to rebound next time because, as you were saying on the forecast last week, she's come off of long layoffs in the past and done a lot better than this. So this was a disappointing effort from her. Hopefully she can get back to those explosive sprint performances that we saw out of her in the past. That is all the racing that we'll recap this week on the TimeformUS Pacecast. As always, we'll be back on Friday to discuss more races that we'll handicap for next weekend on the TimeformUS forecast. I believe the Derby prep coming up this week is the Sam F. Davis from Tampa Bay Downs, where Independence Hall, who is another one of these top Derby prospects, will be making his two-turn debut out there. So that's one that I'm sure we'll discuss and we'll look forward to. But for now, remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel, and you can take in all of this content. So thanks for listening this week, guys, and we'll be back again to talk more about these races on Friday.